What if the greatest lessons Eric Clapton ever learned had nothing to do with playing guitar? Behind the fame and legendary songs were five men who changed the way he saw music, friendship, and life. But who were they? And what did they leave behind that Clapton would carry with him forever? I don't know much about it. Really just a very basic, casual understanding of the history. And honestly, I would have been incredibly nervous playing alongside people of that caliber. There was a time when I imagined being remembered for my songs, records, concerts, guitar solos that seemed to live on their own. When you're young, that's what drives you. You want to outplay everyone. You want to write something timeless. You want your name on the marquee and your music on the radio. For a while, I thought that was all that mattered. But as I've gotten older, those ambitions have softened. These days, when I pick up a guitar, I'm not thinking about applause. I think about faces, conversations, long nights on tour, people who showed up in my life exactly when I needed them, even if I didn't realize it at the time. I've been fortunate to meet some incredible musicians, men whose talent could leave you stunned after just one note, but talent alone never told the full story. The ones who stayed with me weren't always the loudest or most famous. They were the ones who showed me kindness, patience, loyalty, or simply how to keep going when life felt overwhelming. I've made more mistakes than I can count. I've hurt people I cared about. I've spent years running from grief, addiction, regret, memories that don't fade no matter how far you go. There were times I wasn't sure I'd make it back. Looking back now, I can say honestly that I didn't get through those years alone. When people ask who inspired my music, they usually expect me to list legendary guitarists. And yes, there were many of those. But inspiration doesn't always come from where you'd expect. Sometimes it's a riff you can't forget. Sometimes it's watching someone face heartbreak with quiet strength. Sometimes it's a friend who sticks by you even when you've nearly given up on yourself. At this point in my life, gratitude means far more to me than fame ever did. If I could thank the people who shaped who I've become, these are the names I'd start with. Not because they made me famous, but because they made my life deeper and richer in ways no crowd ever could. The first person I need to mention is B King. Most people would naturally assume that my admiration for B began and ended with the guitar. How could it not? Long before I knew him personally, his playing had already become part of the language I was trying to understand. He could take a single note, bend it, hold it for exactly the right amount of time, and somehow make it carry more weight than another player might find in an entire solo. There was discipline in that simplicity. Nothing seemed wasted. His phrasing, his touch, the unmistakable vibrato, the way Lucille seemed to answer whatever emotion he put into her, those things, changed how generations of guitarists heard the instrument, and I was certainly one of them. B showed that the guitar did not have to fill every available space. It could pause, it could breathe, it could answer a singer like another human voice. By the time I was a young guitarist in Britain, trying to absorb everything I could from American blues records, B was already one of the figures against whom serious blues playing had to be measured. We studied those records carefully. We listened not only to which notes were being played, but to the spaces between them. Then came the strange experience of actually meeting the man whose records had traveled so far before he did. B later remembered our first meeting as taking place in New York in 1967. Around the time Cream was in America. We ended up playing together at the Café Au Go Go. Jimi Hendrix and Al Kooper were also part of BB's recollection of that night. I was still a young man, suddenly finding myself in the same room as musicians, whose playing had seemed almost mythical from the other side of the Atlantic. For a British guitarist who had spent years learning from records made by men like B, the situation carried a certain irony. The music had begun in America, crossed the ocean, changed the lives of young musicians like me, and was now coming back across the Atlantic through the British blues movement. What stayed with me, however, was not simply that I had finally played with B. King. It was B himself, the real B. Wasn't anything like the imposing legend people might have imagined. He had every reason to behave like royalty. By then, he had spent years on the road, playing an extraordinary number of shows and developing a sound that could be identified almost immediately. Yet there was remarkably little distance between the public figure and the people around him. He smiled easily. He laughed freely. He had a warmth that could make the intimidation disappear remarkably quickly. That mattered to me more as the years passed. My own relationship with success was rarely simple. There were periods when music gave me everything I thought I wanted, and periods when the rest of my life seemed to be coming apart regardless of what was happening on stage. Fame does not protect you from yourself. Awards don't resolve grief, addiction, regret, or the consequences of decisions you wish you could make again. B represented something different. There was dignity in the way he carried himself, but there was also gratitude. He had lived through a musical world very different from the one younger rock musicians inherited. He had spent years working relentlessly before the blues revival, and the enthusiasm of younger musicians brought him to audiences that had previously overlooked him. Rather than responding to that history with resentment, he spoke with appreciation about the doors that eventually opened. That perspective stayed with me. Some days in my own life, I questioned whether I deserved to be on stage at all. But being around musicians like BB could strip away some of that noise. He reminded you that underneath the careers, the reputations, the charts, and the mythology, there was still the same thing that had attracted us in the beginning. A human being trying to communicate something honestly through music. And B could communicate with astonishing economy. He didn't need a wall of notes. He didn't need to prove that he was technically superior to whoever happened to be standing beside him. He could wait, listen, and then play exactly what the moment required. That was a musical lesson, but over time, I came to see it as something larger. Listening is as important as speaking. Leaving space can be as powerful as filling it. And confidence doesn't always have to announce itself. Decades after that first meeting, our paths came together in a way I could never have imagined as the young guitarist studying his records. In 2000, we made Riding with the King together. By then, we were no longer a young British guitarist meeting one of his heroes for the first time, and an established American bluesman wondering what to make of this new generation. We had known each other for decades. The record allowed those two histories to meet properly. What mattered to me was that the album did not need to become a contest. That would have missed the point entirely. With two recognizable guitar players on the same record, it would have been easy for everything to become about comparison. Who played the better solo? Who had the stronger tone? Who could dominate a particular song? But the blues has never been at its best when it becomes an athletic competition. The important thing was the conversation. One guitar would speak, and the other could answer. Sometimes, the right response was a phrase. Sometimes it was restraint. Sometimes the song needed one of us to move forward, and the other to leave room. That was something B understood instinctively. The album went on to reach listeners far beyond what either of us needed to prove at that stage of our careers, and Riding with the King eventually received the Grammy for Best Traditional Blues Album. I was grateful for that recognition, of course. But trophies were never what made the experience important to me. The extraordinary part was much simpler. I had once been a young man sitting with King Records, trying to understand how someone could make an electric guitar sound so much like a human voice. More than 30 years later, I was sitting across from that same man, making an album with him. Life occasionally gives you circles like that. Years later, when I thought about I didn't think first about awards or record sales. I thought about what he represented to players who came after him. His influence was everywhere, sometimes in musicians who probably didn't even realize how much of their vocabulary ultimately traced back to him. But influence alone doesn't explain why I remember him with such affection. It was the generosity behind the influence. B understood that another musician's success did not diminish his own. He could encourage younger players without needing to compete with them. That sounds simple, but anyone who has spent enough time in the music business knows how rare it can be. Careers create insecurity. Musicians compare themselves with one another. Attention becomes something people fear losing. B had nothing left to prove, and he behaved like a man who understood that. When he died in 2015, I found it difficult to think of the blues without thinking of the space he had occupied in it. I described him then as a beacon for those of us who loved this music, because that was what he had been. He belonged to a generation that connected the blues in its earlier forms to audiences all over the world, and once voices like his disappeared, something irreplaceable disappeared with them. But music has a peculiar way of keeping people present. I can still hear that vibrato. I can still recognize the patience in those phrases. And sometimes, when I play a slow bend on the guitar and allow the note to hang for a moment, Rather than rushing toward the next one, I think of B. B. Not because I'm trying to sound like him. No one could truly sound like B. B King except B. B King. I think of him because the note reminds me of something larger than technique. I learned a great deal from the way he played guitar. I learned even more from the way he carried what that guitar had given him. With warmth, with dignity, with gratitude, and, above all, with generosity. That is what remains with me when the applause is gone. That, more than any award or standing ovation, is the legacy I hope endures. George Harrison entered my life as one of the most gifted musicians I'd ever known. He could have been remembered just for his songs. His work with the Beatles ensured that. But if you knew George away from the spotlight, you'd find someone remarkably gentle. He never felt the need to prove he was the smartest in the room. There was a quiet confidence about him that put people at ease. We shared a love for music that went beyond fame. Hours would pass as we talked about old blues records, guitars, or lesser-known players who deserved recognition. Those conversations remain some of my happiest memories. Life, of course, has a way of complicating things. People have long speculated about the situation with Patty. I understand why it was never simple, never fit neatly into headlines. But looking back, I don't see it as gossip. I see a time when all of us were navigating emotions we barely understood. What amazes me is that George never let bitterness take over our friendship. That doesn't mean there was no pain. There certainly was. But over time, forgiveness found its place. We laughed again. We played music together. We shared dinners, stories, and the kind of deep talks only old friends can have after weathering life's storms. I've always respected that about him. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It takes far more courage than anger ever does. As the years passed, George became less focused on chart positions and record sales. He cared about peace, spirituality, family, and finding balance in a world that constantly demanded more. Being around him changed me. He had a way of slowing things down without saying much. Sometimes we'd sit with guitars and barely speak. The silence never felt awkward. It felt natural, like neither of us needed to impress the other. When his health declined, I found myself thinking less about the legendary Beatle and more about the friend I'd known for years. The one who welcomed me into his home, made me laugh with his dry wit, reminded me that broken relationships can heal when pride is set aside. I still miss those talks. And every now and then, when a J.J. Cale song comes on unexpectedly, I don't picture sold-out arenas or screaming fans. I picture two old friends with guitars nearby, talking about music as if nothing else existed. If anyone taught me that less can truly be more, it was J.J. Cale. Ironically, millions know my versions of After Midnight and Cocaine, but far fewer know the quiet man who wrote them. That never bothered Jay. Jay fame wasn't something he chased. I admired that more than I can express. In this business, it's easy to think your worth depends on your last hit. You're surrounded by expectations, bigger tours, bigger crowds, bigger records. Eventually, you start confusing volume with meaning. JJ never fell into that trap. He played only what the song needed, nothing more. The first time I really listened to his playing, it almost seemed misleading. No flashy solos to show off, no attempt to grab attention. Everything felt effortless, almost casual. Then I realized how hard that simplicity actually is. Anyone can fill silence. Few know when to leave space. That lesson stayed with me throughout my career. As I got older, I found myself stripping things down more. I became less interested in showing off what I could play and more focused on making people feel something. I don't think that shift would have happened without JJ's influence quietly shaping my thinking. What I loved most was that the man off stage was just like the one on the records. No act, no image. He was relaxed, thoughtful, and perfectly content letting others take the spotlight. In an industry built on ego, that made him an outlier. When we finally collaborated on the road to Escondido, never have it felt like two old friends enjoying music without worrying about expectations. There was no pressure to create a masterpiece. We just played. Looking back, those sessions remind me why I fell in love with music, not for awards or reviews, but for the quiet joy of being in a room with someone who understands what you're trying to say before the next chord is even played. JJ never tried to change the world. He just stayed true to himself. Ironically, that's exactly why he influenced so many musicians, including me. Whenever I catch myself overthinking a song, I can almost hear his voice telling me to relax, trust the groove, and let the music breathe. Simple advice. But the older I get, the more I see that these are often the lessons that last the longest. Some people stay in your life for decades. Others are only around briefly, yet leave a mark that never fades. That's how I think of Duane Allman. When I first met him, I already knew he was an exceptional guitarist. People in music had been talking about this young player from the American South who played slide guitar like it was part of his soul. I was curious, but nothing prepared me for what happened when we finally played together. Within minutes, I stopped focusing on technique. I was just listening. Duane had a rare gift. He made the guitar sound almost human. Every phrase carried feeling. Every slide told part of a story. No showing off, no competition, just pure expression. That's uncommon. Working on Layla and other assorted love songs became one of the most unforgettable experiences of my career because of him. People often assume the album was driven entirely by heartbreak, and in many ways, it was. I was wrestling with emotions I couldn't fully explain, pouring everything into the music. What surprised me was how naturally Duane stepped into that emotional space. He seemed to know exactly what each song needed, without endless discussion. Sometimes he'd play one line and suddenly the track felt complete. I remember looking at him more than once, thinking, how did he hear that? The sessions never felt like a contest. They felt like a conversation. That's probably why the music still resonates today. Neither of us was trying to prove who was better. We were both serving the songs, and that honesty made its way onto the record. Then, almost as suddenly as he'd entered my life, he was gone. When I heard about the motorcycle accident, it didn't seem real. Someone so full of energy, so full of ideas, how could he just disappear? But life doesn't wait for readiness. It just moves forward. For a long time, I struggled to listen to those recordings. They reminded me not only of what we created, but of everything that might have been. I often wonder what Duane would have gone on to write, who he'd have inspired, how much more he had to give. We'll never know. But I do know that every time I hear those soaring slide lines on Layla, I don't just hear brilliance. I hear a friend whose time was far too short. Some musicians leave behind albums. Duane left behind moments that still make me stop, close my eyes, and remember how magical it felt to share a room with someone who played as if music were the most natural language in the world. Long before anyone knew my name, John Mayall opened a door that changed my life. Back then, I was just another young guitarist obsessed with the blues. I spent countless hours listening to old American records, trying to understand how players like Muddy Waters, Freddie King, and B.B. King could make a guitar sound so raw and honest. I wanted to be part of that world, but wanting it and belonging to it are two different things. John gave me that chance. Joining the Blues Breakers wasn't just another gig, it was an education. Every rehearsal, every show, every conversation taught me something. John expected everyone around him to take the music seriously, not in a rigid or overbearing manner, but with real respect. He felt the blues should be played with honesty, and that mindset influenced me more deeply than I understood at the time. Many speak of the famous Beano album as if it instantly transformed British blues. Perhaps it did, but when I recall those years, I don't see magazine covers or guitar publications hailing me as some overnight sensation. Instead, I remember tight club stages, long nights on the road, hauling heavy gear, and the quiet thrill of slowly discovering my voice as a musician, gig by gig. John fostered an atmosphere where young players could develop. He wasn't hesitant to bring in new talent, even if he knew they'd eventually leave. And they did again and again. So many musicians cycled through the Blues Breakers before going on to make their mark elsewhere, yet John never seemed resentful. That speaks volumes about him. While some build their success by holding others back, John built his by lifting them up. In hindsight, I can see how uncommon that kind of generosity truly was. Without him, Cream might never have formed. Derek and the Dominoes might never have existed. The path people now link with my name might never have opened. Every chapter that followed began with someone willing to trust a young, unproven guitarist before the world saw any reason to. I've carried that lesson with me. Whenever I've met younger players, I've hoped to pass on even a small part of the support John once gave me. Because sometimes, one chance is all it takes to change everything. Reflecting now on the people who mattered most, I see that each offered something unique. B. King taught me generosity. George Harrison showed me forgiveness. JJ. Cale revealed the power of simplicity. Duane Allman reminded me to play with total truth, and John Mayall provided the space where all those lessons could finally settle in. If I'm remembered as a guitarist, I'm thankful. But if I'm remembered for carrying a piece of those 5 men with me every time I played, then I believe I've left behind something meaningful. When people look back on my life, they'll likely mention the albums Cream, Layla, Tears in Heaven, the tours, the awards, the decades spent with a guitar in hand. And that's fine. Music has given me a life I never dreamed of as a boy in Surrey. When I was young, sitting with a guitar and trying to understand the records that fascinated me, I couldn't possibly have imagined where that instrument would take me. I couldn't have imagined the bands, the studios, the enormous stages, or the strange experience of hearing songs that began in private moments become part of other people's lives. For a long time, those things seemed like the obvious measures of success. A good record mattered. A successful tour mattered. Recognition mattered. When you are young and ambitious, it is difficult not to measure yourself against the people around you. You want to become better. You want to be heard. You want to make something that survives beyond the night you played it. There is nothing necessarily wrong with that ambition. It pushed me forward when I needed pushing. It kept me practicing, listening, searching for something in the guitar that I could call my own. But age changes the way you keep score. The crowds eventually go home. Awards end up sitting somewhere gathering dust. Reviews that once seemed enormously important become old pieces of paper. Even records that consumed months or years of your life eventually belong as much to the people listening to them as they do to you. What remains is often much quieter. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that a life isn't measured only by applause. It's measured by the quiet influence of those who shaped you along the way. None of those 5 men changed me overnight. There was no single conversation after which I suddenly became wiser, kinder, or more certain about the person I wanted to be. Life rarely works that way. Instead, each of them left behind something small enough that I might not have recognized its importance at the time. From B. King, there was generosity, the understanding that greatness doesn't require you to make another person feel smaller. A musician can possess extraordinary authority and still meet people with warmth. B showed me that the respect you receive means less if you are unwilling to give that same respect to others. From George Harrison, there was forgiveness. Our lives became complicated in ways neither of us could have predicted when we first became friends. There was pain in that history, and there were things that could easily have destroyed the friendship altogether. Yet somehow friendship survived. With time, what once seemed impossible to move beyond became part of a much larger story. George taught me that forgiveness does not erase the past. It simply refuses to let the past own everything that comes afterward. From J.J. Cale, there was simplicity. He reminded me that you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't need 10 notes when one will tell the truth. In music, as in life, there is enormous confidence in knowing what can be left out. The older I became, the more valuable that lesson seemed. Duane Allman left something different. His time was terribly short, but he reminded me what it means to play without reservation. When I remember those sessions and hear those slide guitar lines again, I'm reminded that music is most powerful when you stop protecting yourself and give the song everything you have. And John Mayall gave me something without which so much of the rest might never have happened: an opportunity. He trusted a young guitarist and provided a place in which that guitarist could grow. You don't always understand the significance of someone opening a door for you while you are walking through it. Sometimes it takes decades before you turn around and realize how different your life might have been if that person had kept the door closed. Generosity, forgiveness, simplicity, honesty, opportunity. Those lessons became part of me long after the conversations ended. And as I've grown older, I've become increasingly aware of another truth. I've lived longer than many people I once expected to grow old alongside. That is one of the difficult bargains of aging. You accumulate memories, but you also accumulate absences. There are people you still instinctively want to call. There are questions you think of years too late. There are stories that would make a particular friend laugh. And for a second, you forget that you can no longer tell them. You end up carrying voices no one else can hear anymore. But musicians are fortunate in one peculiar way. We leave sounds behind. A photograph can remind you how someone looked. A letter can preserve the words they once chose. But music can do something different. Music can recreate a presence with almost frightening immediacy. A few notes can collapse decades. Sometimes I'll hear a B, King phrase and immediately remember the patience behind it. A J.J. Cale recording can bring back that effortless sense of space. George can return through a familiar song or the sound of a guitar. And when the slide guitar rises through Layla, Dwayne is suddenly young again, playing with all that fire and possibility still ahead of him. For those few minutes, time behaves differently. The person is gone, but something essential remains. Perhaps that is one of music's greatest gifts. It refuses to let the people we love disappear completely. Every generation discovers musicians who belong to another time. A young guitarist can hear B. King today without having stood in a room with him. Someone can discover George Harrison decades after the Beatles first changed popular music. A player who never met J.J. Cale can still learn restraint from him. Someone hearing Duane Allman for the first time can still wonder how a slide guitar could carry so much emotion. And a young blues musician can discover John Mayall and follow the branches of the enormous musical family that grew around the Blues Breakers. That is how influence survives. One person learns something from another. Then that person carries it forward, perhaps without even realizing it. Years later, somebody else hears it, absorbs it, changes it, and passes it on again. I was part of that chain. Before anyone knew my name, I was listening. I listened to the blues musicians whose records reached me in England. I studied what they played and tried to understand why it moved me. Later, I was fortunate enough to meet some of those people. Some became collaborators. Some became friends. Some were only in my life for a comparatively short time. But duration isn't always the measure of importance. There are people you can know for decades without being fundamentally changed by them, and there are people who can walk into a room, play a few notes, and alter the way you hear music for the rest of your life. I feel profoundly lucky to have shared even a brief part of my journey with these extraordinary individuals. They gave me more than inspiration. They gave me perspective. And perspective may be one of the most valuable things age gives back to us. When you are young, you tend to look forward. There is always another record to make, another concert to play, another ambition waiting somewhere ahead. You tell yourself there will be time later to understand what all of it meant. Then one day you realize that you are spending more time looking backward than you once did. Not because the past was perfect. Mine certainly wasn't. There are things I would change if changing them were possible. There are people I hurt. There are years I lost. There were times when I was not the friend, partner, musician, or man I should have been. Success doesn't erase those things, and neither does age. But age can teach you to recognize what was given to you. And I was given an extraordinary amount. I was given music. I was given second chances. I was given friendships that survived things I once thought no friendship could survive. And I was given teachers, although many of them probably never thought of themselves that way. That may be why, if I could speak to younger musicians now, I wouldn't spend much time telling them how to become successful. They will have to decide for themselves what success means. I would tell them to listen. Listen to the people who came before you. Listen to the musicians standing beside you. Leave enough space in your playing to hear what somebody else is trying to say. I would tell them not to confuse attention with importance. There will always be someone playing faster, someone selling more records, someone filling a larger room. If you build your sense of worth around comparisons like those, there will never be a point at which you finally feel you have won. Music isn't a race. A life certainly isn't. The greatest legacy you leave may have very little to do with the things people can count. It may not be the number of records sold. It may not be the size of the crowd. It may not be how many awards sit on a shelf, or how many people recognize your name. It may be a younger musician you encouraged when nobody else took them seriously. It may be a friend you forgave when walking away would have been easier. It may be the respect you showed someone who could offer you nothing in return. It may be a piece of advice you barely remember giving that another person carries for the rest of their life. Most of us will never know all the ways we have affected other people. B. Probably never knew every lesson I took from watching him. George could not have known every moment in which his friendship would return to me years later. JJ may never have realized how often his approach reminded me to remove something rather than add it. Duane had no chance to see how far the music we made together would travel, and John could not have known everything that would eventually grow from the opportunity he gave a young guitarist. Maybe that is the point. The most meaningful influence is often given without knowing what it will become. You offer something. Someone carries it. and life takes it somewhere you will never see. So, when I think about legacy now, I think less about leaving my name behind. Names eventually fade. I think about leaving something useful behind. A sound that encourages somebody to pick up a guitar. A song that helps someone through a difficult night. A lesson passed from one musician to another. A little generosity. A little forgiveness. A little courage to tell the truth. If any of those things continue after the stage is empty, then that is enough. Because in the end, the applause always stops. The lights go down, the room empties. You put the guitar back in its case, and what remains isn't how loudly people cheered. It's the kindness you offered, the encouragement you extended, the people you listened to, the people who listened to you, and the quiet ways you changed lives without even knowing it. Those are the things that truly last. And when I think of B, George, J, Dwayne, and John, that is what I'm most grateful for. Not simply that I had the chance to hear them play, not simply that I had the privilege of playing beside them, but that in different ways, each of them taught me something about how to live. I carried those lessons into my music, and I hope, in some small way, the music carries them forward. Thank you for listening.